Hi, everybody. Welcome to Constitution Happy Hour. Tonight, how many people are here for the first time? Oh my gosh, all newbies. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Constitution Happy Hour. It's kind of like a book club, but we're all reading the same book, Constitution. We have a speaker each night who is a scholar and expert on the United States Constitution. They speak sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes 40 minutes, and then take questions and lead a discussion with all of you. Some housekeeping. You can order drinks at the bar, as you've seen, and you're welcome for future Constitution Happy Hours to bring some dinner in if you like. We strongly encourage everybody to share tables. It's a great opportunity to meet other people as well. So it looks like all the tables are pretty full, but if you see people coming in and you have a seat at your table, invite somebody to join you. Please note that filming is not allowed. We are taping these to put on our website. So if there's critical information that you want to be able to share with your friends, you can do that, but just you can just share the video on our website. Please make sure that your cell phones are silenced. There is a lot of materials that you might find useful over on the tables over there, including pads of paper and pens if you want to take notes. There's also the U.S. citizenship test. There's voter registration cards, and there's a lot of other sort of interesting materials over there that you are welcome to explore. And hopefully everybody here got a copy of the Constitution when you walked in, and you can take those home. So, how did Constitution Happy Hour start? Well, it started with this wonderful project called My Daily Constitution. Oops, AV, this is blinking. Maybe someone could fix this light. This project's called My Daily Constitution by the LA-based artist Linda Pollock. Her idea is to bring people together and engage in creative dialogues about democracy and society. Linda first began My Daily Constitution for a 2002 art exhibition called Democracy When at the Lace Gallery in response to the Patriot Act. Since then, she has initiated Constitution cafes in bars, libraries, cafes, parks, restaurants, churches, and other places where people gather. To quote Linda, "Our Constitution, our democracy is about interpretation. And interpretation means a collective, active dialogue, not just passive consumers and lawmaking producers." The U.S. Constitution is a living document, part of our quotidian life, influencing us in both large and small ways daily. So, our goal is to engage everybody in actually reading their own United States Constitution. I think a lot of us probably don't actually know what the text is, or might find it intimidating, or think it's a gigantic tome that you have to sort of wade through. But you all have a copy now. It's pretty small, it's pretty short, it's very clear, and, well, there's a lot of ambiguity. It's what we're discussing every week. But it's not, you don't have to have a PhD to read this. It's something that we can all engage in and interpret ourselves. I have learned a lot through doing Constitution Happy Hour, and I'm just going to give you a quick recap for those of you who are not immersed in this, because this was kind of news to me. So I'm going to help you out, and if you already know all of this, then just ignore me. The Constitution is three main parts. There's the preamble, which I always thought was sort of as long as Ulysses, but it's not. I'll show you in a second. There are 7 articles, and then there's the amendments. There's 27 amendments. The first 10 are known as the Bill of Rights. So that's the kind of overarching structure. The preamble is just this: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's it. Beautiful words. Articles 1, 2, and 3 really divide up the government. So the Article 1 is all about the role of Congress and the responsibilities of Congress as well. Article 2 defines the role of the president, vice president, and the cabinet. So we hear a lot in the news lately about Article 2, what rights does Article 2 assign to the president, et cetera. So that's what they're talking about, and they're talking about Article 2. And Article 3 defines the judiciary. Today, we're going to be talking about the First Amendment, which is on page 25 of your books. So you can cut to 25 and you'll see the First Amendment is actually incredibly short as well. This is the entire First Amendment. And we're not even talking about the entire First Amendment today. We're just talking about the part in bold. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So individually, we all know we have a constitutional right to free speech, but free speech is debated all the time. And humans are always coming up with innovative new ways to do something totally outrageous that makes us question whether we always want to protect all kinds of speech under the Constitution. For example, do I have the right to make hateful, discriminatory speeches? Do I have the right to lie to you? If I intentionally mislead you or con you, or if I try to manipulate you with lies and misinformation, is that all within my rights to free speech? I think legally the answer is yes, but I'm not sure. Our guest speaker can tell me. But what if it's a politician doing the same thing? Are they protected by free speech laws? So tonight's program is going to look at specific kinds of free speech that are really challenged as we all struggle to interpret the U.S. Constitution and uphold our core values at the same time. Our guest scholar tonight is Rick Hasen. Hasen is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Irvine. He's a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation. He also writes in the areas of legislation and statutory interpretation, remedies, and torts. He's a co-author of leading casebooks in election law and remedies. From 2001 to 2010, he served as co-editor of the Election Law Journal. He's the author of over 100 articles on election law issues published in numerous journals, including the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, and Supreme Court Review. He was elected to the American Law Institute in 2009. And his newest book is called Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. And it's coming out from Yale University Press in February 2020, and he'll be back here at the Hammer on February 26th to talk about his new book. So be sure to come back for that. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Rick Hasen.
Hello. This is a completely different venue than I'm used to at the Hammer. Usually I'm up on a stage and there's a big gap and then there's an audience that I can barely see. This is, I'm told, an opportunity for things to be more interactive, and so I'm going to try to do that today. First, I want to thank Claudia and Linda and the staff of the Hammer for making this opportunity available, because I think that most Americans don't really think about the Constitution other than when they hear that the Supreme Court has decided something under the Constitution, and we kind of have to figure out what that means. Things have become different under the Trump administration. We've learned about parts of the Constitution that we hadn't heard of before, like emoluments. I couldn't be up here and give you a talk about emoluments. I think you actually had someone who spoke about emoluments a few weeks ago. What I'm going to talk about today is the First Amendment, and in particular, the part of the First Amendment which you see here, which says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And we can even ignore the part about the press a little bit. We'll focus mostly on freedom of speech. You know, just a handful of words. And yet, if you pick up a textbook in a law school on the First Amendment, it would probably be about 1,000 pages. And it wouldn't even cover what I teach, primarily campaign finance laws, another 500 pages in our textbook, just from these few words. And these are words that, if you try to apply them to a problem, you might have some issues trying to figure out how it applies. For example, the very beginning of this says, Congress shall make no law. Well, what if California passed a law saying, shut down the Los Angeles Times? doesn't look like it would violate the First Amendment because it says Congress shall make no law. But since the 1920s, the Supreme Court has said, even though it says Congress, because after the Civil War, we passed the 14th Amendment, now the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, including the First Amendment, they apply to the states as well. Right? So you need to understand not just the text of the First Amendment, but you also have to understand how it's been interpreted by the court. And I'm going to try and talk about that today, of the interpretation, in the context of a particular problem. And that's a problem that we saw in the 2016 election. When you have a chance, you can switch to the other slides. A problem we saw in the 2016 election, which was the problem of campaign misinformation spread over social media and otherwise. And so I'm going to show a couple of short videos here to start, and then I'm going to want to ask you a question about what, if anything, we can do about this consistent with the First Amendment.
By feeding a complicated computer program millions of images and sound bites, it can learn to do this.
President Trump is a total and complete dip. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele.
It's called a deepfake. We have the facts. Crafting realistic humanoids in video games or CGI movies used to take years of training, hundreds of people, and millions of dollars. But that's just not the case anymore. Today, with just a little facial mapping and powerful artificial intelligence, these sophisticated machine learning techniques are becoming accessible to people who don't necessarily have massive movie-making budgets. Usually, deepfakes are created to make unique videos, like making Nicolas Cage play Lois Lane in Superman, or putting Steve Buscemi's face on Jennifer Lawrence's body during a Golden Globe speech.
This was very truly surprising for me.
But as the technology advances and becomes more believable, worries abound.
Recent videos circulating online have been manipulated to make the Congresswoman's words sound sluggish and slurred. This video, posted by the Politics Watchdog Facebook page, has more than 28,000 shares and 1.2 million views. It shows Pelosi speaking at the Center for American Progress Ideas Conference on May 22nd. But when compared to the Washington Post's verified feed of the same event, it is clear the Facebook video is playing at 75% of the original speed.
We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country. We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country.
Adjusting the speed like this would make Pelosi's voice sound low and distorted.
We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country.
But her pitch has also been altered to sound more like her natural speech.
We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country.
It's unclear who doctored the original, but versions of the same video were shared by other users on different platforms, some with captions alleging Pelosi was drunk. This is not the first time video of the speaker has been manipulated to portray her in a negative light.
So the question I want to ask, at least for the first part of my talk today, is what, if anything, can and should be done about this, consistent with the First Amendment? So in order to answer a question like that, the first thing you might ask is, well, what's the purpose that the First Amendment is meant to serve? And so I'm going to put out three kinds of theories that have been advanced by scholars as to the purpose that the First Amendment is supposed to serve. One of those is a theory of Robert Bork. You may have heard of Robert Bork. He was someone who was nominated for the Supreme Court, and it was a failed nomination. This is when we ended up getting Justice Anthony Kennedy came on the court. His theory was that the purpose of the First Amendment is to protect political speech, that the most important speech of the First Amendment is that about politics, about who should be elected, about what policies we should have. And so if you have that theory of the First Amendment, you might have certain views about how artistic expression should be protected or other kinds of expression, where you'd be putting politics at the top of that list. So that's one theory of the First Amendment. A second theory of the First Amendment is a theory that's often attributed to Oliver Wendell Holmes, was a thinker and Supreme Court justice over a century ago, and John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher. And so it's a market of ideas approach. And the idea is that what the First Amendment is supposed to protect is the ability for us to have conversations, and through those conversations, the truth will emerge. That if you give free speech to people, they will engage in dialogue, and they will be able to determine what the answers are to particular questions. A third theory that has been advanced is an autonomy theory of the First Amendment. And this says the purpose of the First Amendment is to protect the ability of people to realize their goals. And speech should be that which furthers people's ability for self-realization. And if you take that view, you might have a different view, for example, on whether hate speech could be regulated under the First Amendment than if you take the view that, the Bork view, that it's about political speech. So there are different theories about the First Amendment and how you might answer particular First Amendment questions. For example, whether corporations have the right to spend money in elections, the controversial theory of the Citizens United case from the Supreme Court in 2010. You might have a different answer to the question of whether the government can, for example, stop corporations from spending their money on campaigns, depending on what theory you embrace. And so for about the last century, as First Amendment jurisprudence has grown at the Supreme Court, you've seen the courts debating all kinds of issues. For example, is virtual child pornography something that the First Amendment protects? The Supreme Court had to decide that question. Are laws that ban hate speech, burning of a cross, is that protected by the First Amendment? So all of these kinds of questions have been addressed by the Supreme Court. But we're now facing what I think is a different kind of situation. And it's what I talk about in a recent paper as the emergence of the post-truth era. What should the First Amendment look like in an era where people do not agree? People have always disagreed about opinions, but what if you disagree about some of the basic facts of the world? Right? So you're not just disagreeing about whether climate change is important enough that you should limit the use of fossil fuels. You're instead disagreeing about whether climate change is a problem. And so, for example, if you look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans who say that the Earth is warming due to human activity, you see a huge difference. I don't know if you can see the slides there, but upwards of, at least of those who say that they're paying attention to these issues, 93% of Democrats compared to 23% of Republicans believe that climate change is a major problem. 83% of Democrats say that the Russian government tried to influence the 2016 election, compared to 54% of Republicans who say that Russia did not try to influence the election. And this was a poll taken this past summer before we had the latest controversy over Russia versus the Ukraine. Or one more example, if you ask people if undocumented immigrants are more likely than American citizens to commit crimes, Republicans are much more likely to say that they are than Democrats. Both are incorrect, that the rate is not higher, but Republicans are much more likely to do that. And so the question is, has this post-truth era changed how we should think about the First Amendment? So what we saw in the 2016 election, when we first had the first, I think, fully social media-driven campaign with candidate Trump going to Twitter and putting out lots of information on Twitter, rather than simply going to TV commercials or interviews, where you had outside forces including the Russian government, trying to manipulate public opinion through this kind of putting false information or putting inflammatory information out on social media. We had our first election where social media played a crucial role. And the question that we face in 2020 as the technology gets even more sophisticated is what to do about it. What, if anything, should be done about it? And I should point out that the problem is not just one of misinformation. The problem is also one of agitation. So one of the things that we saw that the Russian government did, according to a number of US government reports, is that they would run advertising on both sides of a political issue. Pro-immigration, anti-immigration. Pro-gay rights, anti-gay rights. At one point, Russian government agents in St. Petersburg set up 2 Facebook groups in a Florida neighborhood, one pro-immigration, one anti-immigration. They organized a rally and a counter-rally and invited people to show up. And people showed up on both street corners protesting against each other. And this whole operation cost these agents $200, $100 to set up each Facebook group. So the question is, what, if anything, can be done about it? And so I want us to think about this question of deepfakes. And I want at your tables to have a discussion for 5 minutes. And the question is, what, if anything, 2 questions. One, what, if anything, do you think should be done about fake videos that might become prevalent in our 2020 election or 2024 election? And so number 1, what, if anything, should be done? And number 2, is what you want to do consistent with the First Amendment as you understand it? So let's take 5 minutes, have discussion at your tables, and then I want to ask some of you what you think. I know you didn't think there'd be homework tonight. 1 more minute. All right. So we have two people with microphones, and so I'm going to ask you if you're interested to raise your hand and tell the group your answer to the two questions. Again, the two questions: what, if anything, should be done, and second, do you think that what's being done is consistent with the First Amendment? So I don't know if you could raise your hand. The people with the microphones can go around to groups. Here we go.
Thanks. Hi. I'm an educator. I hold a doctorate from Pepperdine in education, and I don't think there's anything, I can't remember what order the questions were in, but I don't think there's anything we can do, because there's a segment of the population that if I say this is my hand, will say that's a left-wing conspiracy, that's afoot. They're lost. I think our job is, there's a wonderful quote from Desmond Tutu. We need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. We need to radically improve the educational system so people can think critically in the future, if we have one.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
We decided that you had to fight fire with fire. You have to get better than those that are trying to subvert the truth. And just speak the truth, organize, put our money into it, be better than them.
And so this idea has a name in First Amendment literature. It's called counterspeech. And Justice Kennedy, who just retired from the court in a recent opinion involving false speech, where someone had claimed, a case called United States versus Alvarez, where someone had claimed falsely to be a Medal of Honor winner. He claimed he had won a military medal. And he said the solution is counterspeech, that if you don't like what someone's saying, the response is to say it back. And that is in line with the marketplace of ideas suggestion, which is that the more that people speak, the truth will emerge. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that to the extent that deepfakes are placed there by foreign entities, then it's the obligation of the social media provider to try to root them out as best they can and to expose them as for what they are and somehow mark them if they can. I know Facebook has declined to try to do that, and other social media outlets have declined to do that. Others will, and so I just think that it's troubling. It's hard to do, but it really should be done.
And what would you do if Facebook could determine that speech came from a foreign entity?
Then somehow basically mark it, identify it, document what's going on. Basically.
Okay, and so there are two important ideas in there, and I want to talk about both of them. One has to do with foreign interference in elections. Does that violate the First Amendment? So I want to tell you about a case. You all know the case of Citizens United. I assume you've all at least heard the names. So Citizens United is a case where the Supreme Court said that you cannot stop a business corporation from spending money to try to elect or defeat a candidate to office. The court said the identity of the speaker doesn't matter. It's really about what all of us need to hear, right? It was a very libertarian idea of the First Amendment, very much in line with the idea that there's nothing we can do about this other than try to educate people about the problem. The case Citizens United was brought by a lawyer who he didn't bring it on behalf of General Motors or Google. He brought it on behalf of a small nonprofit corporation because that person looked or that corporation looked more sympathetic. That's a very common thing that lawyers do, right? You find the most sympathetic plaintiff you can to try to bring your case. Well, right after Citizens United was decided, a lawyer brought a case. It was actually a lawyer and a doctor. The lawyer was a Canadian lawyer who was working in New York. And he wanted to spend 50 cents at Kinko's to print flyers that said, "Vote for Obama." And the doctor was an Israeli doctor who was working in New York who wanted to give some money to the National Republican Congressional Committee and to Tom Coburn, who was a politician. And both of those things are against the United States law. So there's a federal law that says, unless you're a citizen or you are a green card holder, you cannot spend or contribute in American elections. And so it was a very smart case, right? Because here was the Supreme Court saying the identity of the speaker doesn't matter. Maybe this lawyer, Benjamin Blumen, the Canadian lawyer who wants to spend 50 cents, maybe he had something that the people of America would want to hear. So the case went to a special 3-judge court, and it was decided by then Judge Kavanaugh, who's now on the Supreme Court. And that court said, we construe the statute so it only applies when a foreign individual wants to say, vote for someone or vote against someone. If they just want to say something like, Obama's great or Trump is fantastic, it doesn't apply. After narrowing it like that, that's how he read the statute, he said, it is part of American self-government that only Americans can participate in deciding who should be elected and what our policy should be. And so this 3-judge court unanimously said it does not violate the First Amendment to ban foreign individuals from spending even 50 cents on something that says vote for, even though a corporation can now spend $1 billion to try to influence an election. Case went to the Supreme Court. Blumen versus Federal Election Commission. The Supreme Court thought that the answer was so obvious that it just affirmed what Judge Kavanaugh had done without even a discussion, without ever explaining how you could say in Citizens United that unlimited spending by corporations is fine, but 50 cents of spending by Mr. Blumen is not. And so we may have different views about whether foreign individuals, governments, entities should be able to participate in elections, but the court has drawn this distinction. I'll get to your comment in 1 second. The second point I want to make is, even if you decide that there's a problem, then the question is, how do you address it? Right? So one thing you could say is no foreign spending. But another thing you could say is label it. And I'm going to come back to this because I think that this is probably the best solution. And it's a solution that's somewhat different than the solution that California has just decided to take. Yes? So the question is, does it matter if the corporation is in the United States or outside? It has to be a domestic corporation or the domestic subsidiary of a foreign corporation where only those on the domestic board make the decision. But just because a corporation is a United States corporation, it could be completely owned by non-American citizens. And so this is why you may remember in 2010, shortly after Citizens United was decided, President Obama was at the State of the Union, and he said, Citizens United is going to allow foreign money to come into our elections. And now that wasn't the you lie, it was the Alito mouthing not true. And it turns out that President Obama was right, not because Citizens United directly said foreign individuals can give money to campaigns, but instead because he saw that if you allow corporations to do this, then it becomes a pathway for foreign money to come in. So just 2 examples that are in the news just in the last month, one just in the last 2 days. Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, the 2 Giuliani friends, they have been indicted for, among other things, funneling $325,000 in money from a Ukrainian oligarch into a pro-Trump super PAC. I can explain what a super PAC is, but the bottom line is there are ways to get foreign money in elections. And just 2 days ago, we saw an indictment of a person out here in Los Angeles who gave $3.5 million to a Democratic pro-Hillary Clinton super PAC, and then to every Democratic member of Congress you can imagine. And then once Clinton lost, gave $1 million to the Trump inauguration, and then was photographed with Trump and doing all these things. And this money also came from a foreign source. We think from the United Arab Emirates. There's a story in the New York Times about this morning. And so there's now a pathway for this foreign money to come into our elections, which has become much easier thanks to Citizens United. Not directly, but indirectly. So one question is, why might we want to limit money? Or the other question is, are there other strategies we might use besides simply banning speech to try to deal with the problem? And labeling is something that we might do as a way of signaling to people. So one of the things that Facebook has voluntarily agreed to do, hasn't done it very well so far, is that if you spread a post that a fact checker that is working with Facebook has labeled as false, you'll get a little notification. This has been labeled as false. Do you still want to share it? And the answer is, of course, yes, right? But the other thing that Facebook has said is that they will not stop politicians from spreading misinformation. And it sounds like they will not stop politicians from saying anything, even if they might otherwise violate the terms of service. Twitter has gone a different route. They said, we're not going to accept political ads. That raises the question of, what's a political ad? Is an ad about climate change a political ad, or does it have to be about a candidate for office? Where are you going to draw that line? So we don't know exactly what Facebook is going to do. But there are things that President Trump has tweeted that some argue have violated Twitter's terms of service, and yet they want to treat politicians differently. So it's a question of not only can you come up with a good government solution, which is what the First Amendment addresses, are there any good private solutions to these problems? Let's take a few more if there's anyone else who wants to address this. Is there anyone else? No? Oh, over here.
Well, no, I just have a question about what you think about the fact that there's a benefit to the fact that it isn't really clear constitutionally where this should be decided. So there can still be public discourse and hearings, and Facebook has to come in and answer questions and can kind of gauge whether the public cares or doesn't care, and if it's better that there's a period of time before the Supreme Court weighs in and dampens that discussion.
So I do generally think that it's when you have new technology, it's good for there to be room for experimentation and see how things work out. But I also think that if it's a danger to our democracy, if people are getting a lot of misinformation, then maybe we need urgent action. And so let me turn to that, right? So what is the concern about misinformation? And this goes to the point that the first audience member made, which is maybe we don't need to worry about this, or maybe we can't worry about it because there's no hope. That if someone's going to be swayed by misinformation, they're going to be swayed by misinformation no matter what. And in fact, there's very interesting social science work that's been done out of Dartmouth by Professor Brendan Nyan and some of his colleagues, which shows that people are not generally that swayed by misinformation. So when they hear that the Pope has endorsed Donald Trump, they don't believe it. But they are likely to discount everything they hear and think that everything is misinformation. So let me remind you of this. This is the last video I'm going to show here.
Yeah, that's it, with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just, like, I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the. You can do anything.
Look at those legs. All I can see is the legs.
I've never said I'm a perfect person, nor pretended to be someone that I'm not. I've said and done things I regret, and the words released today on this more than a decade-old video are one of them.
This was locker room talk. I'm not proud of it. I apologize to my family. I apologize to the American people. Certainly I'm not proud of it, but this is locker room talk. You know, when we have a world where you have ISIS chopping off heads.
So one of the primary dangers I think we face is not that lots of people are going to be swayed by misinformation, but instead what Professors Chesney and Citron have called the liar's dividend. It becomes easy to say, that wasn't me on the tape. And so if it's so easy for Jordan Peele to become Barack Obama, what's to stop the next politician who's caught on tape saying, that's been doctored, that's been altered? And so one of the biggest problems we face now is that the technology has not reached a point where we can detect when something is a fake video, at least when it's done in a sophisticated way. The cheap fake, which is what they call the Nancy Pelosi video, where they just slowed her down and made her seem like she was slurring her words, that's easy to detect, especially because she said those words in a public forum where there was another tape you could compare it to. But when you're talking about a situation where, for example, someone is supposedly wiretapped on a phone call, or there's a secretly recorded video, and the person says, that wasn't me, well, now we have a problem. If the technology can't tell us definitively whether it's someone else, if we believe there's so much misinformation out there, then we're going to be less able to tell the truth. And this technological problem is exacerbated by the rise of what's been called cheap speech. Right? So 20-something years ago, a professor named Eugene Volokh, who teaches up at UCLA Law School, right here up the hill, wrote an article where he said he was kind of imagining what the world would be like when the internet would allow for easy, cheap exchange of ideas. And he had a very positive, democratizing view of what that was going to be like. We would lose some intermediaries, but consistent with the idea of the marketplace of ideas, the truth would come out. But what's happened is that the rise of cheap speech has, I think, undermined the business model for local newspapers and local media in general. Because how did newspapers make money before? Right, subscriptions, but also why would you buy the newspaper? You'd need a classified ad. You want to buy a used car? You're going to buy the paper. You're going to buy this for the classified advertising, right? Or you want to buy a new car? You remember how thick the section used to be advertising the new cars in the Sunday LA Times, right? Now you want to buy a car, you go online, right? And so the economics of local newspapers have been undermined. They were the trusted intermediaries. So I'm old enough to remember growing up, and there was basically three networks, channels 2, 4, and 7, right? And you got your national news from, if it was not Walter Cronkite, it was Tom Brokaw. It was someone who people trusted. And now those intermediaries are gone, and we don't know who to trust. And so what ends up happening is we tend to discount the truth of everything that we hear. It's what an economist named George Akerlof said. He won a Nobel Prize for this idea. He was talking about the used car market. He talked about the market for lemons. And he said, if you go, this is before the era of Carfax and before the rise of CarMax. And I'll talk about why that might be different. But what he said was, when he was writing, if you go to buy a used car, you don't know if you're going to get a good used car that's reliable, that someone kept in good shape, or a lemon. It's very hard to detect that. And so how much you're willing to pay for that car, like if you knew it was a really good car, maybe you'd pay $5,000 for it. But because it is a lemon, potentially, you might only pay $3,000 for that car. Well, if you're only willing to pay $3,000 for that car, if you're the seller who's got the good used car, you're less likely to sell it. Meaning that more lemons are going to go on the market, meaning that the quality, overall quality is going to go down, meaning the price is going to keep spiraling down. And I'm afraid that we're in a similar situation with information and news today. It's much harder to know whether what we're hearing is the truth. Now, the way the used car market solved this problem was that you had entrepreneurs who came up in between. Right? So now you can go to CarMax, right? First of all, you can get information online about if the car has been in accidents. Much cheaper to get that information. But there are intermediaries that are out there. They're dealing with thousands of cars. They can figure it out. They can figure out whether a car is likely to be a lemon or not. And you can use that intermediary in order to figure out what you're going to do. We don't have those intermediaries. And I mentioned earlier the fact checkers. And this goes back again to the first gentleman's comment about this is not my hand, it's my foot. Now we're seeing attacks on the fact checkers. The fact checkers are biased. And so if there's no intermediary at all, how are we supposed to find the truth in this post-truth era? The whole idea of democracy is that people are able to make decisions in line with their own self-interest. But the information market has now been disrupted. This is probably the longest answer I've ever given to a question. The information market has now been disrupted. And so we're in a situation where I'm concerned that people are not going to be able to get reliable information, or at least information that they would accept as reliable, in order to make choices consistent with their preferences. And that's where I think the danger is. Okay, so what do we do about it? So one thing we could do is we could say the government could simply ban fake news. And I'm very troubled by that, because if the government is Donald Trump, as it is today, what he thinks is fake news is very different than what I think is fake news. So giving the government the ability to ban fake news, right, misinformation, is, I think, dangerous. Right? Sometimes we talk about the cure is worse than the disease, and I think giving the government the power to do this could be very dangerous. So what might we do? So one thing we could do, I think, first is we could distinguish between false campaign speech and false election speech. So if someone says, my opponent voted to raise taxes, that's campaign speech. But what if someone says, Democrats vote on Wednesday, Republicans vote on Tuesday? That's a speech about an election. Or there was a flyer that was distributed in some dorm rooms in an election in Wisconsin that said, vote at the polling place of your choice. Well, it turns out if you voted any polling place besides your assigned polling place, your vote didn't count. Right? So maybe we have an interest in allowing the government to ban false speech about elections, about how elections are conducted. But in terms of campaign speech, I think there, I'm with the gentleman who suggested labeling, right? That you label something as fake. And so if every time something came up on the screen that was really Jordan Peele being Barack Obama or Steve Buscemi being Jennifer Lawrence, it would just have altered posted on it. Now there's a technological question of whether we can detect these. But if we can detect them, so one thing is labeling. Is that constitutional? Well, I ran this by Professor Volokh, and he thinks maybe not. Why not? Because now we're compelling someone to speak. We're telling someone to put the word altered on there. Well, so the question is, can you do it for speech where someone does not want to do that and where they're not a candidate for office, right? So we do require candidates to say, I'm John Smith and I approve this message. Can we require it for this? Well, what has California done? California passed a law. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. I'd be interested, actually. I'll ask if you've heard of this afterwards. California has banned deep fakes, except if you label them as, quote, manipulated, or if it is satire or parody. Have any of you heard of this, that this happened last year? Okay, one person. Okay, and the law's only good till 2023 because where it's new, we're experimenting. So this law says if you want to put up a video in California that is a manipulated audio or video, if you don't label it manipulated, you're committing a felony. But not if it's satire or parody. So what's satire or parody? It's not defined in the statute. Yes?
We gave up something called equal time a number of years, I think, under the when Reagan was president, and that was the idea that if you did make anything a political statement, that there had to be the alternative presented. I don't know with a myriad of information sources we have now how that worked, but that's something that has happened in the past.
Right. So it's a really interesting point that you raised, because when Professor Volokh was writing his article in 1991 celebrating the emergence of this cheap speech, he was writing at a time when broadcasters were subject to much more regulation than newspapers on the grounds that we had scarcity, broadcast scarcity, because the spectrum on which TV stations could broadcast was very limited by the government. There weren't that many TV stations. And some of those laws are still on the books applying to broadcast stations. But of course now, you can get cable television and you can have 1,000 channels. And that doesn't count all the YouTube channels, right? So now we have, rather than a trickle, we have a floodgate. So we have the opposite problem. And so nobody, I think, suggests that we could have an equal time rule for the internet, right? Or, constitutionally that we could do that, because instead the answer is you can find whatever you want on the internet, and you can find it's much easier to get the information. You're not stuck watching channels 2, 4, and 7. Instead, you have so much information. If you're going to have a rule that requires some kind of equality, who do you trust to police that, right, is the other question. Now, the First Amendment only applies when it's the government that's acting. So Facebook is not subject to the First Amendment. So if Facebook decided tomorrow, we're not allowing this group or that group to talk, they could shut those people off. Now, politically, they probably don't want to do that. But they are not First Amendment actors. The Supreme Court has said, you're a cable TV station, you're an internet provider, internet content provider, you're not subject to the First Amendment. So you could have a law that says, label these things as fake, and then Facebook could decide we're going to take them down or not, right? So that would give some choice. But I don't think, it's hard for me to imagine, especially the current Supreme Court, the Supreme Court that decided Citizens United, would allow any kind of regulation that would require some kind of equal time. The court has said in the context in Citizens United, in the context of campaign finance, the idea that you could lower the speech of some to raise the speech of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment, right? A much of a libertarian idea. In contrast to the idea that Justice Breyer came up with in some of his cases, where he said there are First Amendment interests on both sides, because there's also a First Amendment right to hear accurate information and to hear balanced information, right? So there's a split on the court. But now the court is very strong. It has 5 very strong libertarian-oriented, marketplace of ideas-oriented justices. And so I think if this California law gets challenged, it is quite likely that it would be struck down as unconstitutional, because it is compelled speech and because it's somewhat arbitrary. So one of the benefits of labeling something as altered as opposed to manipulated, you don't have to decide what's parody, what's satire. Everything would be labeled altered. You could still enjoy your satire. I would just have altered in the corner. That's why I think that's a better solution to the problem. But California's gone more extreme than that. There's a question over here.
Is this on? Yeah. There's some very difficult information theoretic questions in here. And we've long debated in information theory whether something has to be true to be information. and generally not. So when something is information, or even when it's true, depends heavily on the context. And even determining when two things are the same is a very deep metaphysical question that has been almost impossible to determine technically. So when we say, you know, who gets to label, you've got a real context and perspective question. And I mean, I'm in favor of the labeling idea of getting more provenance, getting more history, but who gets to label it is itself part of what we're going to have to get into here. Let me throw it back to you and say, what does this do to theories of legal evidence? And at what point, you know, who has to come up with the evidence to determine whether something is indeed true or altered or information or misinformation?
Right, so I think that you raise some very profound, difficult questions. I think they're actually somewhat easier when it comes to whether something is a manipulated video than when it comes to something that is a pure statement of fact, you know, whether someone voted to raise taxes or something like that. Because at least the hope is, according to the technologists that I've been reading, that we'll get to a point within the next few years where we'll be able to tell whether video or audio has been manipulated, that it did not come from an original source. So there would be a technological answer to that question. And calling something altered or not altered is not the same as calling it true or false. It's just saying that it differs from the original source. These raise all kinds of profound questions throughout the law, right? So it's not just in a campaign where we care whether a video is true. It could be relevant in a criminal trial when someone is wiretapped, right? It could be relevant in a divorce when someone produces some email that's on that's in the record, right? So these are going to create problems. Then the question is whether or not, at least for documentary evidence, there's some way of verifying the authenticity of the document. And then, of course, the question is who's going to authenticate it. I think we're going to be facing all those questions. I don't have answers to those questions, but I think we're going to be facing all of those questions of authentication going forward. Is there another hand? I thought that was up. No. So California and Texas have decided that the way to deal with this is through a kind of ban on certain deepfakes, but not on other kinds of misinformation. And if you think about the kinds of misinformation, Hillary Clinton is a murderer. Hillary Clinton is a Satan. That was one that was spread a fair amount. A lot of these things are not even false statements, right? The Hillary Clinton is a Satan is an expression of opinion, right? And of course, she's not Satan; she's a Satan. So I feel like that's something. I talked about how much of the activity that the Russian government engaged in was not even false speech. So in my upcoming book, Election Meltdown, I've got a meme that was spread, that got spread on Instagram and Facebook very widely, that has a picture of a group of Latino immigrants standing in line. The picture actually turns out to be they're standing in front of a immigration agency in Los Angeles, and it says, "Voter fraud is a crime." And there were a lot of these kind of claims that Latinos and African Americans were committing voter fraud, completely unsubstantiated, and spread on right-wing communities. The other thing that, the other big push that the Russian government did was try to suppress the African American vote by saying things like, Hillary Clinton doesn't think Black Lives Matter. She only wants your vote, and spreading things like that. Most of these statements were not false statements. Now, even if you have a law against false statements and you had a mechanism to police it, what we're seeing is not falsity, but we're seeing instead statements that are meant to divide us and to polarize us. And the Supreme Court has said that you can't stop even uncomfortable and distasteful speech just because you don't like it. You can't even stop hate speech if you don't like it. You can only stop speech that would cause someone to imminently want to fight you, right, that would incite you. And so the Supreme Court said you can't stop speech because it's distasteful. This is why the Nazis get to march in Skokie, right, the famous case about that. And so it's not clear what the solution would be if the problem is not misinformation, but the problem is just meant to divide us. And I have to tell you, in the 2017 special election in Alabama, the election between Roy Moore, remember Roy Moore, the Ten Commandments judge, and Doug Jones, in that race, there were all kinds of misinformation attempts that were funded by Democrats, not by Doug Jones, but independent Democrats, to try to, for example, convince Alabama voters that Roy Moore would try to bring back prohibition. We've got our 21st Amendment beer back there, and that wouldn't be allowed. And it was Baptists for More, but it was actually a group of Democratic operatives. They also had thousands of Twitter bots writing things in Cyrillic and following Roy Moore. We love Roy Moore. The Russians love Roy Moore, and it got picked up by the local newspaper there. Look at the Russians at it again, and it was actually something domestic. So when I was here doing a talk with Professor Justin Levitt of Loyola Law School last year, he said, we don't need the Russians to hack us, we can hack ourselves. And I think that's what we're facing. So a lot of the problems that we see with the kind of polarization and speech is not a problem of misinformation or false speech, but a problem instead of incendiary speech. And I think the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment, there's not a lot of room to act there. So that raises some serious questions. There's one more point I want to make before I open it up to talk about campaign issues or election issues or anything else you'd like to talk about that I'm capable of responding to in this time, which is, and here's there's the Dry Alabama website from Roy Moore, if you could see that. It's another point about disclosure, right? So one of the things I said is that we might try labeling deepfakes and altered audio to try to figure out when speech is false. But the other problem we have is that a lot of the campaign advertising that we have right now, we don't know who's behind it. Now, why do we care about disclosure? About, I think 12 years ago, there was a ballot proposition on the ballot that was going to take away the ability of public utilities to compete with private utilities. Something I'm guessing most of you in this room don't have a strong opinion about. I know I don't have a strong opinion about. The Yes campaign, which would prevent the public utilities from competing with private utilities, was funded almost 100% by Pacific Gas and Electric. And every ad that appeared on TV, all $55 million of ads said, paid for by Yes on 10, major funding by Pacific Gas and Electric. 55 million on the yes side, 1 million on the no side, and the measure went down to defeat. I see that as a positive story because this was obviously Pacific Gas and Electric trying to stop competition in the energy market. We in California are incredibly lucky that when there's advertising in state elections, we're told, oh, it's the teachers union. Oh, it's Chevron, so you know who's actually behind these things. We don't have that on the federal level. So you can create a PAC tomorrow. You can call it, what was Stephen Colbert, Americans for a Better Tomorrow PAC? And that can be your name. And then it's very hard to find out, and it's become very easy to create ways of getting around this. Right now, if you run an ad on Facebook, online, not on TV or radio, and you say, Joe Biden is going to save this country. And you never say vote for Joe Biden. If you put that online, you could spend $1 billion and no one needs to know your identity. The Supreme Court has said it does not violate the First Amendment to require most people to disclose most of the time when they spend money on elections. But the rules were written for TV and radio and for newspapers and express advocacy when you say vote for, vote against. Congress has refused to update those laws to apply to online advertising. unless the advertising says vote for or vote against, then we do not get to know who's behind it. Yes, it's true, foreign individuals cannot spend money on this, but identities are not disclosed, so how are we going to know? How is Facebook even going to know? And so the problem is not the Supreme Court. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court on an 8-to-1 vote said disclosure laws do not violate the First Amendment. They're a better way to deal with the problem. And yet Congress hasn't acted to update the laws to allow us to have disclosure. So that's the other thing we need. If we're going to be hit with misinformation, it might be, or incendiary messages, it would be useful for us to know who is behind the speech. So my two solutions here are, number one, for deepfakes, disclosure on those ads that they're altered, and number two, just better campaign finance information so voters know when they're looking at an ad. If you see an ad and you know who paid for it, that might give you a good clue. If I told you there's a ballot measure on the California ballot and it's supported by the NRA and it's opposed by Planned Parenthood, and I don't tell you anything else, I bet most of you could tell me how you're going to vote. Right? We rely on these shortcuts. I don't have to tell you what the topic is, right? You're going to follow that cue. That's why in elections where there's a Democrat or Republican on the ballot, that's a good shortcut for you if you don't know much about this particular race, right? In a nonpartisan race, you don't know. And so the question is, how can we give voters valuable information? So voters should be able to see on an ad, they should be able to click on an ad on Facebook or on other social media and be able to find out exactly who's behind it. So that's what I think we need. Let me end with one last point, which is I'm worried about misinformation affecting Supreme Court justices themselves. Not just how we make decisions, but about how the justices make decisions. So one of my main areas is voting rights. And so there was an interview with Justice Scalia. I wrote a book about Justice Scalia a few years ago. And there was this great interview with him in New York Magazine by Jennifer Senior. And she asked him what his media diet was. What do you read? What do you watch? And he said we get the Wall Street Journal, get the Washington Times. We used to get the Washington Post, but it went too far for me. I couldn't handle it anymore. It was slanted. It was nasty. Who needs to get upset anymore? He doesn't read the New York Times. He doesn't read the Washington Post. So he says he gets his news from the talk guys, talk radio. And so when the Supreme Court is going to decide a question about a voter identification law and whether voter fraud justifies a law that makes it harder for people to vote, if you're listening to Fox News all day or you're visiting the Daily Caller all day, you're going to have a much different view of the world than if you're watching MSNBC and you're reading some left-leaning media. And so how are justices going to get out of their own information silos, right? So the justices, like the rest of us, right? Everybody agrees with us in the world. It's amazing. If you go on your social media feed, because you pick the people that you're following, of course they agree with you. And then when someone upsets that, they're, going to take that person out, right? What if the justices are in their silos? And what happens when the justices become celebrities and their heads get even larger? So here are the Ruth Bader Ginsburg judgments. Don't lose your appeal. Right? We've turned our justices into celebrities, right? There's the ones we love and the ones we hate. We get their T-shirts, right? And so I worry that in our hyper-polarized world where information is now so difficult to get, that even the Supreme Court that has to interpret the First Amendment, that has to interpret the other parts of the Constitution, that even the Supreme Court is going to have trouble making decisions and figuring out what is true information, because the legal system itself can't always produce the truth. And so much of this becomes the value judgments of the justices. Why is it that from 1998 to 2006, the Supreme Court didn't strike down a single campaign finance law under the First Amendment? But from 2006 to 2019, it has struck down or limited every campaign finance law that it's addressed. The answer? Justice O'Connor retired and she was replaced by Justice Alito. Different judges, different worldviews, different understandings of the state of the world. And I think it's only going to get worse because we're all living in these information silos. More of this in that book, Election Meltdown. And so let me just now, I think, open it up for your comments, your questions about, and it doesn't have to be just about, specifically about this, but any questions related to upcoming election issues. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Mike?
Hello?
Now it's on.
You brought up disclosure, and it seems to me that politicians get so much money from corporations and wealthy individuals, they really don't have any great desire to change the disclosure laws. How do we get around that? I mean, how do the Koch brothers can keep giving all this money and get politicians, to vote the way they want?
Well, in fact, corporations still cannot give directly to candidates. They can give to allied groups that support candidates, but they can't give directly to the candidates. What's happened with disclosure laws is kind of like what's happened with environmental laws and lots of other laws. We now have a partisan divide. It used to not be this way, right? So when Congress passed the first major campaign finance law in 1971 and then revised it to make it stronger after Watergate in 1974, it was truly bipartisan. In 2002, when Congress passed the McCain-Feingold law, the official name of the McCain-Feingold law is the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. What made it bipartisan? 11 Republicans joined with Democrats to pass the law. Today, the Honest Ads Act, which is a law that would extend disclosure to online areas, is supported almost exclusively by Democrats. It's become another partisan issue. One of the first things, actually the very first thing that Democrats did when they took the House back over in 2018 is they passed H.R. 1, which was a comprehensive election reform bill that included major provisions to change the disclosure laws. So the crass political answer is, if Democrats take control of the House, the Senate by a filibuster-proof majority, or they blow up the filibuster, and the presidency, they can pass a strong disclosure law, and they will. So even though I think Democrats right now are doing very well, in some ways better than Republicans, in taking undisclosed money, but I think they have an ideological commitment to getting rid of the status quo and changing the disclosure laws. I think they'd rather fight where neither party could use so-called dark money.
Sorry, question and a comment. Comment first. So we run a civic tech mobile app, and it's nonpartisan, issue-based, and we have to pin ourselves on Facebook as sponsored by. They consider us a political entity, so we kind of we go back and forth. We have to appeal all the time, and we're literally just saying this is the process of impeachment. Nothing is vote for or against. So anyways, that's the comment. Question is, do you have concern on just court packing and the fact that 170 judges, federal judges, were appointed by Trump, and a lot of them being unqualified, and what that impact is when you compare that to what's happening on the Supreme Court as well? So what's the implications of that, and how long is that going to affect us, since those are lifelong positions?
Sure. So first, on your comment, Facebook has been having a lot of trouble figuring out what counts as political and who needs. They were making the New York Times register as political, and well, maybe they should, right? So what the rules are going to be, I think Facebook would actually be in much better shape if there were federal laws that dealt with online advertising for campaigns, and then Facebook would be out of that business. I'm not sure why they have opposed federal laws. I think that would make it easier for them, and they wouldn't have to make any of these line drawing determinations. On the question of the courts, I wrote a piece for Talking Points Memo before the 2016 election, which was titled something like, "The Supreme Court is the most important civil rights issue of our time." And I basically said, the next election, the next president is likely to be able to appoint justices that are going to control the Supreme Court for the next generation, everything you might care about, from the environment to race to abortion to voting rights, it all depends, because of the litigious nature of our society and the nature of our Constitution, on who sits on the Supreme Court, because we know that the best predictor of how a justice is going to vote is the president that appointed them, not because the justices are acting consciously to help their parties, but instead because the justices are picked because they have certain ideological commitments that line up with what the parties want. That ship has now sailed. We are now, I think, in a situation where the Supreme Court has a pretty solid majority of conservatives, and that majority might be further solidified before the end of the presidential election. I don't know that Justice Ginsburg is going to make it through the end of the term. And already Mitch McConnell has said that the so-called Biden rule, which he made up, which is what stopped the confirmation of Merrick Garland, is not going to apply if there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Justice Thomas, there's also rumors that he could retire. And on the lower courts, I think you're right. Most cases do not make it to the Supreme Court. And there are now judges on the courts of appeals that are going to have effects on our democracy for the next generation. I think at some point, if there is a new progressive majority in the country that is being stopped by a conservative judiciary, then there will be more serious attempts to add justices or subtract justices or change the nature of the courts. I think it's inevitable. The courts don't have an army, right? So there's only so much they can do, but Americans have tolerated things. I think the issue of the courts has resonated much more for the right than for the left in this country. I think that's going to change when, for example, the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade. If it does that, I think that would actually energize the left in thinking about the court, but it comes at a very steep price when the court makes these major changes before people are politically activated. But it's a major concern. And you're right, there have been some of the judges, not on the Supreme Court. I think the qualifications of the justices on the Supreme Court, you might disagree with them, you might think they're not fit to be on the Supreme Court, but not because of their intellect or their ability to write. But on some of the lower courts, there have been judges confirmed who never tried a case. There have been judges confirmed who have viewpoints that are way out of line, I think, with the way most Americans think, including a judge who was confirmed yesterday for a district court judgeship in Missouri, who believes that in vitro fertilization undermines motherhood and is something that the state could ban. So, I mean, we're talking about some lack of qualification, also some very fringe ideas from my viewpoint. And I think these are going to be time bombs that are going to go off for the next few decades. I mean, I'm watching right now as the courts are deciding whether they're going to blow up the entire Affordable Care Act. A third attempt to try and do that. So it's very worrisome, very worrisome.
Hi.
Hi.
What we've been talking about, it's been concerning to me about the shift in our culture of information. And so when we were discussing the deepfakes and also what I've been reading about that we're sort of in an arms race. We're trying to come up with a way for technology to uncover what is a deepfake as the technology for producing them becomes better and stronger and faster. And that also has come up in other arenas. So I've been here, I listened to a TED Talk about quantum computers. And so those are computers that are based on the principles of quantum physics. And whereas a computer now could, let's say, uncover your password to an account by testing out different combinations of letters and numbers and whatever, come up with a password, they'd have to do it one by one. A quantum computer could do multiple variations all at the same time and almost instantaneously break into an account that right now we believe is protected and that we have fairly advanced ways of protecting against hackers and things like that. But that technology is advancing at a rate that the sort of counter technology is not. And so in a culture where that's happening, but also we're concerned about the ownership and access to this information. So we know that we're getting targeted ads, and we're being targeted because our information is big data that's being sold by companies that we don't get to see how that happens. We just bait it, and we talk about it, we like rise up against it. But if all of that is advancing, and that the counter technology is slowly advancing but slower, how do you think that would affect our access to political information, our knowledge of what type of information is politicized, what's being presented to you, and why that information reached you, and excuse me. I guess bear with me because I haven't really, I don't know exactly what my question is, but it's concerning to me.
So I think that I have a few responses. One is, it's very hard to know where technology is going to take us. There are very different predictions about where technology is going to take us. I remember when we first started having the ability to post documents on the internet, there was a question of, well, what's that going to do to copyright law? Because people are not going to make books anymore because there's going to be no way to protect your intellectual property. And yet people are still writing books. And so I don't want to be an alarmist, but I do think that it's a problem, and especially when countervailing measures are slower, as they are when you're trying to reverse engineer what someone's done and figure out how to solve it. But I think the biggest danger is the one I mentioned, which is the danger of the liar's dividend and the general view that people are going to have that everything is misinformation. When you distrust everything, that's itself a problem. Right? So it's bad if we believe the false speech, but it's also bad if we don't believe the true speech. And we can't figure out the difference between truth and falsity. And so the key, I think, is to find ways technologically to verify when something is legitimate or authentic. And that's something I think we have to continue to work on. I think there was a question over here.
Yeah, just wanted to say that altered is kind of a big net, because merely changing the brightness on something alters it. Changing the file size of something alters it.
Yes.
So then you kind of go down that slippery slope of people saying, well, everything's altered. No news clip is ever aired that isn't in some way altered. So then where are you?
Well, I'm a law professor, and I have a footnote that deals with that in my article. So that's how we shove the problems in the footnotes. But it is a real problem, and I think what you have to do is you need to have some kind of exception for normal editing practices, and you have to be able to define those and do it in a way that is accepting of those normal journalistic practices and rejecting those that are not. And in a lot of contexts, I've argued that we need to recognize journalistic norms as a baseline against which we compare other conduct. And that's why there's a difference between certain kind of news content that is trustworthy, because there are norms of how journalists, for example, would, if they're TV news, for example, what would be acceptable to do to a video and what would not be acceptable to do to a video. But these are hard problems. So back to the Facebook example, Facebook decided to create a trusted news source just a couple of months ago. And they created controversy because they included Breitbart among the sources. And Breitbart has been known to spread false information, and that they don't comply with normal journalistic norms. For me to even say that, I will be attacked as being a left-wing crazy, because I'm not. So there really is a problem when there isn't acceptance of the journal. But I think there are normal journalistic norms about what TV news producers think is acceptable, and that would be the baseline about things that would not have to be labeled as altered if all you were doing, for example, was cutting a 30-second clip down to 23 seconds or something like that.
Hi, I walked in a bit late, so I hope this is not covered already, but we live in a system that is supposed to not be two-party, but the reality is it's two-party. So I'm curious on your take on if there was a way to enforce us having more parties that are actually represented more equally, what that could do, because I feel like we're at a place where we have one or the other and neither are working and they're at war with each other, so where do we go? And I've been hearing some conversation about trying to bring back more of a spread out like a lot of other countries do. So I'm just curious on your take on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at other countries, whether they have multi-party systems or two parties, we have a worldwide problem. So I don't know that, you look at Great Britain now, they have more than just their two parties and they're struggling, right? Great Britain and Israel, I think, are both having their third election each within a very short period. And so these are problems. But let me throw out one possible way to make third parties more relevant without saying, we're going to junk the system and not have Congress and have a parliament. And so here's a proposal that's been adopted in some places like San Francisco. It's called ranked choice voting. And the way it works is you vote for your first, second, and third choice candidates. They tally up all the first place winners. If nobody gets 50%, they look at whoever got the last votes. They take the people that all voted for, say, number 3. They look at who was your second choice, and then they attribute those votes. So why would that matter? Well, imagine that you're campaigning, say you're the Democratic candidate, and you're campaigning for president in Ohio, and you know that some people like Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate, or Jill Stein, or whoever. You might tailor your message and tailor your proposals to try to capture those voters too. And so that may be a way to get, number one, you end up with a majority winner. Someone gets at least 50% under the system. But it's also a way for minor parties to play more relevant of a role. It also would create more interesting dynamics because, if you're the Republican candidate and you're very socially conservative, but you want to get votes from the libertarian supporters, you might change your tune a little bit. So I think that could be interesting and make things more relevant. And what we see now is kind of the opposite. So, right, we're going to have an election coming up between, we think, Trump and a Democratic opponent, and it's going to be very close, for example, in Arizona. Well, the Green Party just didn't qualify for the ballot in Arizona for president. So that's good for Democrats, right? So it creates these perverse incentives. Democrats support libertarians to try to take votes away from Trump. Republicans fund the Green Party in order to try to take votes away from the Democratic candidate. And so that ranked choice voting would upset that, and I think that could make it better. Last question.
I look at the internet as like our former newspaper. It's got everything and anything. And I was thinking, when newspapers first arrived on the scene, how did it convince everybody, oh, read this, will get you informed? Was everybody on board? And how did that become now like, oh, this is where I get my information? How did they regulate that? How did they convince the public, read my newspaper, this is legit?
That's a great question. And when I presented this paper at a lecture in St. Louis a few months ago, one of the commentators in the paper made this point and said, we've always had misinformation. There was really a very narrow period between, say, the 1960s or 70s and the early 2000s when we had reliable sources of news. If you go back and you look, for example, at the turn of the last century, beginning 1900, you think about the Spanish-American War. You had the Hearst papers, trying to get us to go to war. There was the yellow press. There were partisan newspapers. But eventually what you had, and this goes back to an earlier answer, you had the emergence of journalistic norms of truth and objectivity. You need to have two sources in order to verify things. You always give someone a chance to respond. So those norms emerged. And so there really was this period where, say, a golden period of 40, 50 years. And now we're back to where we were before. But I think, and this is the point I made in response to that point when it was made by the commentator, was things are much worse now because the economics of spreading false information has become so much lower. And the ability to disrupt things so much easier that now we face information overload. we're bombarded with information all the time, and it's very difficult to know what the truth is. So one of the things that is really troubling is both Democrats and Republicans have gone into some areas where the local newspaper has folded or is about to fold or is just an online presence, and they've started websites that look like local newspapers, but they're really propaganda for the party. And, you know, when you're no longer picking up the Cleveland Plain Dealer because it doesn't exist as a physical piece of paper anymore, and there's something else called the Cleveland News, and it's now the next generation, they're not going to know what the Cleveland Plain Dealer was. And so we're going to have a really hard time figuring out which are the websites and the entities that are actually complying with journalistic norms and which are not. And so that is one of my main worries about this upcoming era of cheap speech. Thank you all very much.